excited to be here. My name is Cody Evers. I'm with Portland State University. Matt Hamilton is going to share the presentation with me. He's from Ohio State University, but I also acknowledge Max Nielsen-Pincus and EJ, as well as Heidi as well, who I don't think is with us today. So I'll say just in starting that it's great to follow Amber here. I think there's a number of interesting things that I'd like to follow up on, including the CWPP planning process in California, as well as some of the updates we were talking about. So I think there's some interesting connections here. I'll say that when Annie, you invited us to present here, things were a little bit different in the sense that we were planning to submit this as a grant proposal to NSF through a program called the Disaster Resilience Research Grant. And we decided to pull the plug on that, even though we would still argue that we think it's a great fit. It's an engineering focused program, and what they're interested in is looking at research into disaster resilience that supports improved science-based measures, including improved planning, policy decisions, designs, codes, standards. This year was a little bit different in the sense that they actually brought in wildfire risk reduction to that process through the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. But we got the sense that this was very engineering focused, even though we would make the argument that standards, codes, zones, et cetera, are only effective insofar as they're adopted, even the best ones. So that's, I think, what we're focusing on here. And one of the things that I think that Matt or all of us would say about CWPPs is they actually are fantastically interesting from a research perspective, document across very diverse scales as well as states or circumstances about what communities are doing in very localized ways to prepare for disaster, be more resilient to adapt to changing conditions. And so the presentation today is to share a little bit of how we're framing that, as well as to keep it very open in terms of the feedback we get from all of you as experts embedded in this that can inform that research. So let me go on to the next slide. Oh. There we go. So, CWPPs, obviously, as Amber mentioned, well, it's no news to any of you, have been around for some time now, and were developed in, a very specific kind of policy program context. And one of the things that we're curious about it, just knowing about some of the dynamics of why wildfire risk seems to be increasing over time, or is increasing over time, is why development is not more centered in those plans. Or the degree to which development drives that risk. And a couple facts here that are probably common knowledge to all of you, but I think are worth stating. One is between 1999 and 2010, WUI expanded drastically. And in fact, it was the greatest land cover change across the entire US. Houses in the WUI of the Western US increased 2.5 times faster than the entire US. So there's a 40% increase across the entire US, a doubling in the number of houses in the Western US. So it's a distinctly, or it's becoming increasingly more so a Western phenomena. And in the West in particular, that is the creation of WUI, the growth of WUI is largely the result of new structures. It's not the kind of vegetation growing into the community. It's houses being built in areas that previously there was very few, and there are more and more, and yet those areas continue to be fire prone. So this leads to some big questions about how we think about wildfire risk, and also secondarily why this development continues. So you'll all be familiar with this fire triangle on the left, where oftentimes we talk about fire as some sort of the result of ignition patterns, as well as fuels, as well as weather conditions. And it's the combination of those things that ultimately dictate when and where fire happens, and kind of the fire regime in different areas over time. But what obviously is the second part of that from a risk perspective is, where does the risk come from? And there's a couple elements to that. One is, of course, exposure, which is just to say, where are things of value that are sensitive to fire, and to what degree do those overlap with the fire itself? That's obviously what we think about with the WUI, but there's also a vulnerability component there, which is to say, it has a lot to do with kind of the social capacity to adapt, implement, and live with fire. Why does development continue? There's a number of reasons here that have been talked about in the literature, and a lot of them are actually described as paradoxes, which is interesting, which is to say that sometimes what happens is kind of contrary to what we think should happen. So in the first case here, the safe development paradox is oftentimes describing how the federal government, for good reasons, makes it safer to develop in areas by subsidizing kind of risk control. So the classic case where this came out was Hurricane Katrina and the levees and dikes, which created new areas for development, but then also made for greater hazard when all of a sudden, that large event did occur. Secondly, local governments struggle to pick up the cost of safeguarding vulnerabilities because in the end, it is quite expensive, and there are many competing things for those resources. And then, finally, it's this idea of a mitigation paradox, which is to say mitigation at an individual level is quite expensive. And hard to prioritize against everything else. And that the benefits of that oftentimes are a little bit more tenuous for an individual, just given the inherent, or the uncertainty of it, and that they actually accrue more at the community level. And so the dynamics of these three things kind of create, well, essentially what we've seen, which is to say, despite a realization of, the vulnerability of communities to fire, we tend not to see as much a focus on that. And this leads us to our research questions, that kind of underlie this grant, which primarily is in this first one, which is how did development interests interact with local collaborative efforts to manage wildfire risk? Where are they present, and how are they there? Secondly, what factors predict when development stakeholders, development interests are part of or participate in this planning process? And how, when they are present, how does development shape CWPP as an ongoing process? And these are our larger research questions. I'll turn it over to Matt at this point to talk about some of the pilot data that we've collected, that we're kind of building some of these, building this interest from.
Thanks, Cody. So Cody, I'll just let you know when to advance, I guess, to the next slide. So yeah, as Cody mentioned, well, first of all, I should introduce myself, I guess. My name is Matt Hamilton. I'm at the Ohio State University. That's all I'll say. Yeah, I'll talk about some of the data that we've been collecting so far, a little bit how we're kind of conceptualizing these research questions, and then really what I want to do is tee off a discussion about how this type of research strikes folks who are on this call, and obviously we're extremely interested in input and guidance, to be honest. So this is where we're focusing, these 11 states. These green arrows indicate kind of the status of data in hand. So we've collected all the CWPP documents, including original plans as well as revisions or updates that we could find from 5 states so far. We're pretty happy with those 5, and then we've recently extended those 5 states to another 6, and basically, so this is collection that goes back to the early 2000s, and so within these kind of sets of documents, we've been particularly interested in who participates, because of course the documents list core team members, other folks who kind of participated more on an ad hoc basis. Our ultimate, I should back up and just say that the original interest in gathering these documents was to provide kind of a window into how people engage in collaborative risk mitigation decision-making or policy processes and to really think about this as a network. And so that's where these rosters of participants were so kind of appealing to us, because of course, lots of people participate in multiple plans. Each individual plan has multiple participants. And so you can start to think about this as kind of a network of, people participating in multiple plans stretched across the entire, US West. And then of course, we also mapped out the jurisdictions of these plans, which allowed us to integrate the kind of the social aspects of this data, the planning process, who participates, and so on, with the biophysical processes that are playing out in these fire-prone areas. So we know where fires are, projected fires, and so on. And then we've done a little bit of work to start to code or classify the actual plans, goals, recommendations, kind of expected outputs of these planning processes. That work is a little bit more preliminary. So as I mentioned, pilot data for these 5 states. We're closing in on around 1,000 of these plans. There are some gaps in our data set. I noticed a lot of folks on this call are from California, and one of those big gaps is actually California. So if anyone knows of a repository of CWPP documents, please let us know. That we would really appreciate any information about that. So I guess you can advance to the next slide there, Cody. So just a quick word on these, CWPP jurisdictions. It's been kind of like a mixed methods approach of collecting data from secondary data sources where we could, obviously county level plans, we can use county boundaries, fire protection districts, we can often find that online. The vast majority, though, of these jurisdictions were hand mapped from the documents themselves. So this is just one example. And then we can start thinking about, how do these plans actually sit on these landscapes? Because they're not, when people talk about, mosaics of different land use or property boundaries and things like that, usually the image that's conjured is one of almost like a chessboard. But the reality, of course, is that these plans and the jurisdictions are stacked on top of one another. And so that really raises very interesting questions about, well, what is risk interdependence in these types of landscapes where multiple planning processes are either nested inside of one another or otherwise kind of, geographically in the same places. So that's all I'll say about that slide there. You could move on there, Cody. Cody, do you want to talk about this one? Because this is some research that I think you and Max had done.
Yeah, so this is, kind of some parallel work that was conducted 3-4 years ago with the support of a group called METI, in which case we looked at communities at risk, not necessarily CWP jurisdictions, but in that process asked or were able to talk with 300 key informants, which were typically emergency risk managers, fire department, city council, commissioners, et cetera. And these are, some of the things that we were able to find in terms of what are the sort of actions that communities at risk are taking. And I think it's informative in terms of this conversation. So in that work, we found out that 66% reported the development of a CWPP that covered the community at risk. 90%, the most common thing that was kind of a result of this was improvements in emergency response communication preparedness. There's obviously a big focus on workshops and public outreach within those communities. And then that was followed by 60% reporting some plan or implementation of hazardous fuel reduction. And I guess to bring home the point that we're talking about today is 30% discussed updates to codes, standards, in WUI zoning, which I would say is not a insignificant number, but it was the least likely of all the actions that we asked communities about of what they had done.
So just to kind of, you all are familiar with CWPPs, but just to kind of explain how we use these documents as a source of data, we literally went through these documents and found the sections where either in a little block of text or more in like a table or in some other format, participants in these planning processes were listed. And sometimes they were distinguished between, you know, the core team members, or if there was a private contractor who assisted preparation of the document. But we basically followed, you know, what the document, you know, however the document listed people, you know, we included them as participants. And, you know, this is just an example from, I think, a Colorado plan. And as you might expect, these really ran kind of the gamut of course, many local residents, representatives of different organizations. But you know, kind of tying this back to the theme of this research, there's very, very you know, sparse or spotty participation of, you know, representatives of development interests. You know, development, you know, groups, real estate agents, insurance agents, you know, all these different kind of people and representatives who you know, engage with the kind of development community, really didn't seem to be at the table. Of course, they were in very, you know, in some plans, but this seemed to be kind of a gap. And I guess you can advance on to the next slide there. So just as another way of thinking about these data, you know, a couple of us are really, we evangelize networks. We love thinking about these kind of collaborative decision-making processes in terms, you know, very formally as networks. And that's how we see, that's one way in which we see, you know, this particular data set and these CWPPs. Here that's depicted, and so what you're looking at are the actual documents themselves. So in our networks, we have documents and people. But here, the lines between these dots, which are colored by the state in which they came from, the lines which are in gray indicate that at least one person, one individual, participated in those two plans that are connected by the line. So obviously, we see a lot of geographic clustering. You know, people from Colorado are much more likely to participate in other plans from Colorado. But we do, in fact, see quite a bit of, you know, state boundary spanning. And when we focus on more kind of restrictive geographic spaces, just within one state, for example, we actually see a surprising amount of boundary spanning activity there. So I guess you can go on there, Cody, to the next slide. So that's sort of what we've done to date, and here's what, you know, where we're thinking of kind of going from here. We've got this, you know, in our view, you know, pretty cool data set of literally just the CWPP documents. And all we've done is scratch the surface in mapping the jurisdictions where that information wasn't otherwise available, and kind of extracting these lists of the people who participated in the CWPPs. What we really want to do is zero in on the extent to which, you know, representatives of the development community are represented in these planning processes, and also think about how the CWPP plans, recommendations, or goals incorporate, you know, ideas or plans related to development codes, standards, zoning, and so forth. So that'll be kind of like a review of this, like a text analysis of these CWPPs. The much more exciting work, in my view, is actually going out and talking to people. And so what we would like to do, assuming we get some grant funding at some point, is to focus on a subset of CWPP communities or the regions in which CWPPs were developed, and really try to capture some diversity in terms of, you know, getting areas in which there were, you know, little to no integration of development interests in the CWPP planning process, and those in which that integration was very natural and very kind of robust. And to ask people, you know, how did things go? You know, what did the decision-making process look like, and how were you know, how were development you know, representatives integrated? And then also kind of conduct, postmortem sounds a little bit cynical, but ask how things turned out. What got implemented? You know, what was the kind of the fidelity between, you know, what was documented in the plan and what actually happened afterwards? In cases where, you know, the plan might have been revised or updated later, you know, what, you know, almost somebody had a question for a second ago about, what was the motivation for updating the plan? Things like that. So so that's our the core kind of motivation for the second phase of this research. And Cody, you can go on to what I think is the last slide. So here's where we'd really like to kind of turn open, jump out of the fishbowl, I guess, and ask some questions to this group of folks that are on this call. And I'm just going to run through them here because we don't want to go one by one. We'd rather just sort of see what folks are interested in terms of these questions. But I'll just read them. So we're interested in, I guess, first as a more general question, are we barking up the right tree? Is there really a gap between the development community and the fire risk mitigation kind of planning process community? And to the extent that there is, what are some of the barriers that seem to be kind of exacerbating or contributing to this gap? When integration is successful, what does that look like? Anecdotally or even more generally. And in those communities where integration is very successful, how did that come to be? Were there is it leadership, or was it a fire experience, things of that nature? We're very interested in understanding kind of what those enabling conditions were. And then we love CWPPs, but we recognize that CWPPs are one of many planning processes, collaborative decision-making processes that are really important in this very large landscape. So we're interested in leads or recommendations for other kind of similar or adjacent planning processes that we should really have keep in mind.